Technology is working. That's a good time to get started. All right. Good morning, folks, and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I am Chris Richards, as always, the Eclectic Radical. And before I introduce my guest this week, I do have to note that after a couple of months ago, the drama of Twitter only wanting to let paid subscribers stream video to Twitter, now StreamYard wants to raise the price of their cheapest plan by $20 a month, which means not only am I going to have to consider whether or not I want to pay for Twitter if I want to be able to stream to Twitter again, but just to stream to YouTube, it's going to cost me another $20 every month to keep trying to do this. I don't have any corporate sponsorship. I'm just trying to give people a really independent alternative to all those Sunday shows out there who aren't going to have guests of the sort that I'm going to have. You're generally not going to see Green Party candidates and the Socialist Equality Party and SWOP Behind Bars on Meet the Press. So please consider supporting me. The PayPal is Eclectic Radical. The Cash App is Eclectic Radical. The Patreon is Eclectic Radical. If you want to subscribe every month, please consider it. We really need your help right now, and it's really hard to keep independent shows on the air. I don't want to make a lot of money. I just need to pay my expenses to keep doing this. Please help me out. And on that note, joining me today is Alex Andrews from the aforementioned SWOP Behind Bars. First, tell us the organization. Tell us about the organization.
The Sex Worker Outreach Project Behind Bars is an organization that provides community support and services to people who are incarcerated as they are working to be released. We also operate the only national hotline for sex workers in the country. And that number is 877-776-2004.
And that's important. So, folks, please, if you're going to clip and share one part of this episode, start with that one. So, basically, people need help. SWOP tries to provide it. Sounds like mutual aid, which is what I've been telling people we should all be doing for years now in the first place. Am I right or am I confused?
Mutual aid has been around since, the beginning of time. People sharing their resources to enhance their communities, better their lives, and increase their families' access to healthy fruits and vegetables and stuff like that has been going on for a really long time. When, in the Old West, even as recent as that, after the Depression, communities kicked in and put together care packages for widows, veterans, for a lot of different kinds of groups. We saw in the beginning of the pandemic, sex workers were the very first ones to launch massive mutual aid campaigns, and they did incredibly well distributing those resources within the sex worker rights community and within sex workers, street-based sex workers who didn't have access to the kind of information that they knew how to do to protect themselves from COVID.
And I know a lot of the early accounts that were on Twitter that were offering people things like free masks or place to order cheap masks. I know a lot of those accounts were run by sex workers when that.
Oh, yes. Sex workers stepped into this harm reduction space of COVID prevention like champs. We have been preaching prevention of pretty much everything for a very, very long time. So regardless of what your strategy is to prevent disease and disorder, you can always look to us because we are going to have some of the best ideas out there. And we're going to be able to reach communities that you aren't able to reach. It was incredibly awesome time to watch sex workers, lean in and to put the resources out there that needed to be out there. Needless to say, none of us had networks that were big enough to manage all of this, but it was incredible to see the way the invisible strings of the community came out, and it was definitely noticed. Our attention to making sure that people had the actual things that they need and the information that they needed to stay safe was critical during that time.
No, and a lot of times people outside the community have been able to benefit because they are aware of such things. Sometimes they even help the community, though that seems a little less common than I'd like it to be. But
it's actually incredibly common. The outside community has been pivotal in not only raising the call for aid, but in raising the call for new policies and for new voices to be listened to. So, yeah, our allies are a valuable part of the way things move. And now that allies are really starting to better understand how to support sex workers and survivors, they're starting to do brilliantly in many spaces.
Well, I'm going to start with one of the obvious ones because I've been seeing a big push for it, generally from so-called feminists who seem to believe that all sex workers are women being paid to have heterosexual sex with men. That appear to have decided the best way to help sex workers is to outlaw their customers, which seems counterproductive to me.
Yes. It's very, when we as human beings are faced with a problem, especially on one that has an international scale and a face on it that is so fearsome, as the idea of human trafficking, it's not uncommon at all for us to go to our worst case scenario and start just shoveling out Band-Aids to cover up, the fallout or the reasons for or whatever. So it's not really surprising that, having seen human trafficking, someone immediately leaps to the idea that, well, criminalizing everybody is a good idea, or criminalizing one portion of this. They have to have a bad guy. There has to be a bad guy and a good guy, because if there isn't, then criminal justice doesn't know what to do. And since we're asking our law enforcement to be our social workers as well, we've put a lot of responsibility on them that they are not trained for. And that's why it's such an epic fail. You got the wrong people in charge of the task.
Now, without getting deep into the woods of the unspoken conversation about how necessary and useful law enforcement really is in the first place, let's just take a step back, and I will phrase the stupid question, also the obvious question: but are law enforcement officers really in any way equipped to be social workers?
No.
I mean,
like I'm not equipped to be a law enforcement agent. We have different jobs.
If you're my age, not just my age either, though, if you're younger than me, cop shows tend to be less about the unofficial stuff and more about the official stuff. Unless it's a SHIELD, Chicago PD, The Wire sort of show that almost tells the truth about cops, but always still wants to pretend that somehow the bad people are accountable.
Or it was just the one bad cop. They don't want to talk about the culture that.
Well, yeah, that was the biggest problem about the SHIELD was all the time that people were spending trying to bust the bad cops, when in actual fact, the bad cops run the department. But a lot of the stuff is procedural these days and focused very much on how cops do things, and cops are the good guys. Whereas I remember, the 1970s, let's try to show what a cop's life is like sort of show, where you had cops essentially having to play the role of unqualified social workers because they allegedly had no other choice, which would be great if cops actually did that instead of shooting people. But if that ever happened at all, it was rare.
It's not really a mystery why they see themselves as the rescuers with the capes and all. You know what I mean? If that's the food that they grew up watching on television, no wonder they thought that they were going to come out of this more as heroes than zeros. So yeah.
That's why, despite everything, despite all its flaws, my favorite cop show will always be Hill Street Blues, which ends with a guy, which ends with a central character being thrown off the force, despite not having actually done the bad thing he's accused of, because of his history of bad things and the fact that the captain doesn't feel able to defend someone who's consistently been so bad. And basically they end with a sort of it can't really get better feeling. And
there we are.
I don't know that any other show has ever been quite that honest about policing, even with its flaws and the fact that it still tries to show good people in the system trying to struggle against the system. It does show that the good people face consequences for being good, and often face worse consequences than the bad people in some ways.
Yeah, there are always consequences.
And there's a great subplot in the first season about a guy who just wants to help other people, who dresses up like a superhero and stops muggings and things like that. And over the course of that season, he gets shot by a cop.
Oh, wow, that's great. The irony.
Yeah, but that's the way it would really happen.
Yep.
If there really were a superhero, the cops would kill him.
Yeah, well, probably. You're probably not wrong.
I'm getting too much. I'm getting too anti-cop and not talking enough about the topic again.
No,
but it's a reason. There's a reason. You're an advocate and someone involved in outreach with people who are behind bars for sex work, and I'm still thinking about the Crystal Kaiser conviction.
Yes, that was pretty horrific.
It was, because you've got you've got a trafficked minor, and you've got a suspect who the police knew was trafficking minors, and yet the cops arrest the trafficked minor for killing the person they knew was trafficking minors. If this whole notion of gun rights and self-defense that the right pushes seems to fall apart if the person who defends themselves is defending themselves against someone more worthy, as the police see it.
Yeah, I mean, her defense wasn't quite as cut and dried as that.
Yeah.
But the fact remains is that she was a survivor of violence, and the person that she lashed out at was her abuser. And that's how she saw him in those days, hours, weeks, months, whatever, is literally trying to save herself and seeing no other option, literally having no good choices. And so this is what she was left with. It's my understanding that the judge had a pretty well executed pre-sentencing document about much of her history and what had happened there. It's unfortunate that there wasn't a little more compassion shown there. It should be illegal for there to not be more compassion shown.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why did she? I mean, yeah. If the pre-sentencing document was so good, why was the sentence so tough? Then becomes the question.
Well, I mean, and I think again we have to look back at our institution. Our criminal justice system looks at a victim and a criminal.
Yeah, and it's always cut and dried, even when it's not.
Yes, and the victim doesn't look like Crystal Kaiser. Crystal Kaiser looks like the perpetrator, so therefore she must be guilty. The victim in this case, or Crystal's victim, he's not with us anymore. Therefore, he very much looks like a victim. So it in a very cut and dried sort of way, where we literally have no other information to gather on here. It does appear that something happened here, but it's the backstory that we haven't looked into, and that is what is missing from our criminal justice system, is the strings that bring the story together. We don't get to a horrific situation like murder without some intersecting issues taking place that led up to that violence taking place. So we have to look at our society as a whole and say, what have we done to drive this trend of violence against women, exploitation, trafficking, poverty? What are all the factors that took place that led up to this? The foster care system, lack of any other good options, lack of education. I mean, there are so many things that factor in. Homelessness. I mean, there are just constantly things that factor in.
If I had to try to reduce it to a root cause, which, sometimes that's a dangerous game. But if I really had to try to reduce it to a root cause, it would come down to society has a love-hate relationship with sex. Society loves sex, but hates to admit it, and publicly hates anyone who has more sex than they believe they are having. That's number one.
And hates people even more who like it.
Yes. But at the same time, punishes people for not having it and makes them feel inferior. So we've got all three of those prongs.
Yeah.
Then you've got the fact that society hates women while putting a certain kind of woman on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got the fact that society hates queer people unless they are white and heteronormative and high income.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question becomes, well, who do we actually mean when we say society? And more frighteningly, it looks like when we say society, we actually mean a bunch of corporations like the people funding Cop City in Atlanta.
Yeah. Yep. You're absolutely right.
And then you find out that these corporations that fund Cop City are the same corporations pushing all sorts of laws, whether it's tougher on drugs, tougher on crime, tougher on prostitution. I was reading something in the news the other day about a city in Philadelphia a city in Pennsylvania in the Philly suburbs wanting to specifically put a loitering ordinance targeting sex workers on the books.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would have to break it down to poverty, generational poverty.
Mm-hmm.
One of the greatest activists I've ever known, and as long as I've heard of activism, straight up said, I am unwilling to have a conversation with someone about, different abortion or anything else until we're really willing to have a conversation about generational poverty. If you're ready to have that conversation, I'm not really ready to have any other advocacy conversations, because that is at the root of all of our societal ills.
Well, I mean, even more, and why does poverty exist? Poverty exists because our system is set up for the people at the top to be able to make their living, not even make their living, to be able to support their lifestyle by extracting from the rest of us.
Exactly.
Just squeezing us dry and throwing us away.
Mm-hmm.
And I put it like that because it really feels like that when you look at specific stories of how people are treated.
Mm-hmm.
Crystal Kaiser was thrown away, locked up.
So many others. I wish that I could say that that's the only story like that I've ever heard. I wish that I genuinely wish that I could say that. And I can't.
George Floyd was thrown away in a different way.
Yeah. But when we're talking, people who trade sex and who have experienced violence, those stories happen all the time. The Crystal Kaiser story is just getting the press right now, but it is through decades and decades of work on other people's parts, not on mine, that is drawing more and more attention to the real injustice behind all of these. And, we have Amber Nickerson in Alaska. There are other cases, and we have Donald Castleberry in Ohio. We have so many sex workers have done what they needed to do to provide to protect themselves against violence, whether it be an intimate partner, whether it be a client, as we saw in Joey the Player. He would not be headed to prison for 20 years if it weren't for sex workers.
No, and that makes sense. And yet and then you've got, it's not, his victims were not strictly sex workers, but
no, they were
basically making people. No, I'm thinking of somebody else and trying to make a transition in my head.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
But he was treating them that way. There's the crazy I shouldn't say crazy because he is premeditated and evil. The Democratic Party donor in California, Ed Buck, who was coercing homeless black men to work as sex workers for him and then killing them with overdoses.
Yes. Isn't that terrifying?
It is terrifying.
We're talking about it on a podcast because we all know about it, but nobody is willing to go get this motherfucker. He's been under all sorts of scrutiny, but he's never been convicted of any crimes or held accountable for anything beyond basic slap on the wrist for rich guy drug use. Yeah.
And which brings me to another topic. Have you ever noticed, if you're a rich person versus a homeless person, drug use is a totally different animal. A rich person up until Hunter Biden, when the Republicans decided they wanted to make an example of him, right. Rich people get away with drug use all the time.
Yeah.
Rehab, fines, slaps on the wrist, county jail, no felonies, often no misdemeanors, no serious loss of civil rights.
Yeah.
And then you've got other people who are sitting in prison for 20 some years for nonviolent drug use and because of a third strike. And the attorney general of their state won't let them out of prison because they need the fights to keep them in prison even because they need the labor.
Right. And I think that just gives us an excellent time to circle back to the reason why I'm even here today.
Yes.
You put out a tweet that said, what if your job were a crime?
Yes.
And it's because that, under criminalization, under the mantle of criminalization, prostitution is criminalized. The purchase of it, the selling of it, the merchandising of it. They have gone so far with the trafficking laws to say that two people who trade sex can't communicate with each other, or it then becomes a conspiracy. There's a lot of things that are going on. The world of criminalization is bad. Then they have legalization, which is the exact opposite, where you have to go and you have to get fingerprinted and you have to go to the sheriff's office and you have to get a license, you have to take a class and you have to take continuing education credits. And then you have to work at a licensed establishment within that has been licensed by the state. And it's not a realistic, it's not a realistic model to address generational poverty. Then you have partial criminalization, which is what a lot of the feminists are trying to drag us into.
The so-called Nordic model.
The Swedish model, the Nordic model, the Norway model. We call it the end privacy model, and there's another term that we use for it, but all of these are partial criminalization, where they want to criminalize the purchaser of a service, but not the person selling it.
I would call it the starvation model, because basically you're saying we're not going to arrest you, but we're going to make you starve to death because we're going to criminalize all your, and that's the best case scenario.
But you are a reasonable person with a logical outlook on the way that things work. And because the criminal justice system is only seeking to put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, this is what they've come up with, is that, okay, well, we're not going to arrest the sex workers. We're just going to arrest the ones who want to exploit them. And that's all the clients. So now we've gone from all the sex workers being bad and can only be rescued by arrest to where it's all the clients that are bad. And we must rescue the sex workers from them. It's gotten bananas. It's based on economic theory, which is that the supply, if there's a great supply, then demand is up. Whereas if you reduce the demand for a service or a product or anything like that, then you will automatically reduce the supply. Now, that is so silly. But first of all, economic theory is based on the price of goods and services, not on the availability. So supply and demand don't drive each other. Supply and demand in economic theory it says, here you are. This is what happened with your supply and demand. Yep. This is what happened with your demand. That's how it actually operates. And if you reduce demand, then what happens is your price goes down.
Yes.
So the person who is selling the service actually has to do more labor in order to make money. So by driving down demand, which they're not actually doing, but they think they are, by driving down demand, they are increasing the potential exploitation if you are going to say all sex workers are being exploited. So you're actually forcing more exploitation and trafficking rather than reducing it. I mean, that is the legit way the world works.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That's something I pulled off my hat and said, abortion is bad, and all men should die. That's not how it should. That's not how things are going to work out. So I think it's really important that anti-trafficking and the general public be fully informed that, well, ending demand and end demand models seem like, that does make kind of logical sense, to not arrest the victims or survivors, but not be able to go a little bit further and see that we're not providing any services for the victims who are impacted by the arrest of the breadwinner that is in their family. So if you have a client who has a family and he's got 2 young daughters and the family splits up because he gets arrested for seeing a sex worker, if he gets arrested for that, he's going to lose his job. They're going to lose their home. They're going to lose their transportation, but there are no victim services for them. No. And they are more likely, we know based on data, that they are more likely to be exposed to violence or exploitation as a result of growing up in a one-parent household and being subjected to possible homelessness, food insecurity, and all of the other traumatic things that happen.
If you want to go all Jack London on it, and take a really good page from a really horrible story, you could even see a situation where dude going to jail for buying sex leads to a situation where his wife and daughter can only support themselves by selling sex.
Well, and that happens all the time. That happens all the time. It's not unusual at all. And that's why it really bothers me that people fail to really drill down to the unintended consequences that are going to take place when you enact policies and legislation without fully thinking them through. And that's when we end with things like the war on drugs, where we see 20 years later, the fallout has been intense.
Well, the war on drugs is my favorite story of political matters creating a tail that wags the dog and never stops hurting people.
Yeah.
The Nixon administration wanted to prosecute Black activists and peace activists and people they considered, white radical communists, etc.
Betcha.
And their belief was that white communists used pot and acid and Black communists used pot and heroin. And if we criminalize pot, heroin, and acid and make the penalties really, really, really prohibitive, then we'll be able to bust all the peace workers and Black activists we don't like. And that became the war on drugs, which no longer allegedly has anything to do with peace activism or black activism, and is its own self-sustaining monster that makes lots and lots of money for all sorts of people who provide services to cops and people who have been labeled drug addicts by the system and prison systems and everybody else who's looking to make some money. And most importantly, and this is the part everyone forgets, and I'm so glad that I've talked to prison activists too. You know, it's like everything that goes into prison goes away from everything else, and there is no such thing anymore as a public nonprofit prison. Even the public prisons are renting prisoners to corporations.
Yeah.
The chain gang from the movie Brubaker is just digitized now, and people never leave the prisons, but the chain gang has become the basis of our entire industrial system in this country.
In many cases it has, and it's extremely dangerous for us to be continuing to feed that exploitative labor system. You know, unfortunately, that exploitative labor system is the only support really that the prison system has given to prisoners who will be at some point in time exiting from behind those walls. And what little, 3 to 5 cents a day that they may earn has gone into a savings account and might add up to $1,000 by the time they're ready to leave prison. If it's not been eaten up with whatever. So not only has it exploited the labor for, the greater good of the, capital.
But you realize, though, that the ultimate result of the prison labor system is that the best firefighters in the world, who with 20, 30 years experience, can't get hired in their profession when they get out of prison.
Yeah.
Now, what logic is that?
Well, we're not here to talk about logical stuff, right? That's why you have a show.
Well, I think the logic matters, though.
Yeah.
I think the logic matters because it seems like that the end goal of this system is one where everybody who isn't a cop or a member of the at least the upper middle class is in prison.
Yeah.
I struggle to see what that country looks like, but prison seems to be the main labor support of the American employer right now, and it's scary.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
And this is why I care about criminalized workers, or people who have their clients criminalized, for that matter. They tried the same end demand thing with the drug war. That was what DARE and Just Say No and all that stuff from the 80s and 90s was about.
Just a toilet flush of useless programming.
Yeah. None of that did anything. I mean, I was like the one kid that DARE worked on. I didn't even smoke pot until I was in my 20s, but I'm the exception and not the rule. A lot of my friends were like, oh, wow, I didn't know drugs could do so many things, or that there were so many different kinds of drugs.
There are a lot of different kinds. And, with our war on drugs, we've never really levelized any of those substances. And so when you have marijuana being scheduled the same as a different kind of drug, and then they just automatically keep shoving drugs into that classification because it just keeps increasing the criminalization factor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet heroin, this is my favorite story. Heroin was invented by the same man who invented aspirin for the same company, Bayer. And heroin, like aspirin, was originally not the name of the drug, but the corporate brand. Aspirin was a corporate brand. The actual drug for aspirin is acetylsalicylic acid, which nobody wants to put on a label. So for years, though, every aspirin that wasn't Bayer was labeled acetylsalicylic acid, but people just called it aspirin. And when Bayer lost the patent and other people started making aspirin, everybody started calling it aspirin because Bayer had called it aspirin, and there wasn't really a trademark on aspirin anymore. And it was just hilarious. Everybody was suddenly calling it by its corporate brand name, despite the fact that that corporate brand name only ever existed as a corporate brand name. And heroin is the same way. Heroin comes from the German word heroisch, which means heroic, because heroin gave you the ability to heroically ignore pain. And what's more is that when it became available to the public, heroin, the drug is called diamorphine, by the way. Heroin was a huge boon to people dealing with pain. Now, you can make a lot of complaints about how Bayer marketed it, saying that it's non-addictive and putting it in toothache drops for kids might have been a step far. And we can have all sorts of conversations about how the product was sold. But in the end, heroin was a savior for people experiencing chronic pain, because mostly work-related. So when we're talking about the first people to benefit from heroin, we're talking about industrial workers who were suffering chronic pain from working in factories in horrible conditions with constant repetitive stress motion.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? And then we put heroin on the market, and it is embraced because people hurt less.
Yeah.
And for a period of, 30 or 40 years, about 40 years, 1885 to 1925, there's this great alternative to all these other drugs that don't work well. And while it is addictive, it really takes care of your chronic pain. So if it hurts less, maybe the addiction's worth it.
Yeah.
And so in 1925, heroin is banned in the United States. And all these people who had a gift given to them now have it taken away. And for the next 40 years, until 1965, the majority of new drugs were designer drugs produced for hospitals and doctors and chronic pain patients to fill the U.S. marketing gap created by the banning of heroin.
Oh, wow.
So things like Demerol and Dilaudid and all these other fancy painkillers that you may have been prescribed and may have not worked as well as opioids, all of those were designer drugs specifically put together to try to do the same things as heroin without being as addictive. But all of them are addictive and none of them work as well. Until in 1965, a man named Paul Jansen invents fentanyl. And fentanyl is everything heroin was for pain patients. It's cheap. It's easy to get. It works for your pain. And Paul Jansen built a pharmaceutical company, Janssen, successfully on fentanyl, exactly the way Bayer built their empire on heroin and aspirin.
Wow.
And now we're seeing fentanyl attacked in exactly the same way as heroin by exactly the same people who are ignoring the fact that the number one way that people become heroin or fentanyl addicts is to be prescribed Dilaudid or something similar, find out that it costs too much for the help they're getting, and they turn, because someone suggests it, to heroin or fentanyl on the street instead, and they find out it works.
Yeah.
So they switch from the legal, expensive, unhelpful drug to the cheap, easily available, helpful drug. And this is called the opioid epidemic by cops, who then proceed to beat and kill and arrest those people.
Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And that's what happens when you look at the long-term unintended consequences of enacting legislation and policies and educational programming and everything that goes against what the reality is. You know, I mean, they just make shit up, and then the rest of us have to follow along with their moral or ethical, windings, whatever that might be.
And while this is not something that is really understood the way it should be, even by too many doctors who treat chronic pain shortens your life.
Yep.
Whether we're talking about its stress issues on other parts of your body, or whether we are talking about mental health effects from untreated chronic pain,
yep.
People who deal with lots of pain die sooner than people who don't.
Yep. That's very true. Very true.
And I know I've gotten off topic here, and I'm sorry, but these two topics feed into each other so well, because often you hear the war on sex workers communicated as a way to rescue sex workers from drugs and poverty, as if the sex work is what's causing the drugs and poverty, as opposed to the poverty causing the drugs and sex work.
Yeah.
And if people were really free to make the choices they wanted as to how to live, then maybe you could make an argument about whether or not some of these things should be criminal.
Somebody had a bunch of good choices.
Yeah.
To make, which would they really choose if they had all those good choices?
Yes, exactly.
Many times people don't have a menu of choices to choose from, so they choose the least worst option, which is to not starve in some cases.
Yes. To not starve, to hurt less.
Yes. I mean, I would just like to see policies and programming enacted with that thought in mind. What can we do by enacting the policies and programs to just not fucking hurt anybody?
And I would go so far as to say, on a basic level, because I think most people, a lot more people than we think have done this at least once. If you've ever hooked up with someone to have a place to stay that night, you've kind of done survival sex work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think more people have done that who don't think of themselves as sex workers than people really consider.
Yep.
And I know that I've done little things in my life, like selling custom porn stories to bored housewives, that, while not traditional, would definitely be considered sex work by some. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that's ever been my primary support, but that was something I did.
Get where you can get it.
I was looking for ways to make more money back then.
Working within the erotic labor market has a lot of different faces. Sex workers are all different kinds of people. They have all different kinds of skill sets. They have all different kinds of hobbies. Many of them are the same religion as you are, or as someone else's. They have pets, they have plants, they have, favorite foods, they have favorite colors.
They have significant others and relationships and kids and parents and lives and all the other things we have.
Yes. And I think that I would just like, and if your job were a crime and you had all of these other different hats to wear, how would you feel about all of your hats that you have to wear if that is the question? Your job is a crime.
Especially when we talked about cops as social workers. Sex workers do more social work than cops and don't get any credit for it.
And I'm not here to debate, the benefits of being in one, in one position or another, because I respect someone's decision for them to make
Everybody's.
the best choice that is for them at the time. You know, I don't have
Right.
I don't have a requirement that someone make, you know, the least worst choice. I mean, that is just, you know, I'd love to be able to serve up somebody, you know, a platter full of everything's going to be okay, along with a side of, okay, you know, everything's going to be okay, along with another side of everything's going to be okay.
And it,
but I don't have that to give.
And it just comes back to, why can't we have a society where everybody's needs are met? And it comes back because someone has to make a profit on meeting those needs under the way our society is currently organized.
Yeah, and they haven't decided who they're going to let be the profiteer on that.
Exactly. And if the system requires someone to make a profit on meeting all needs, then it only makes sense that you would have people who are trying to profit from meeting sexual needs, because, you know, that's part of all needs.
Yeah.
If you're really saying people want things, people need things, other people get them things, and those people should be paid, then what's your argument against sex work?
That's right.
And if you're saying, well, profiteering off necessities is bad, then why are you allowed to profiteer off of food or housing or water, but you can't profit off of erotic behavior or human companionship?
Yep.
I mean, I know people who, I know sex workers, and I know clients, and I know there are people who just talk to their sex workers and don't actually do much else. And I know there are people who do quite a lot of things.
Yep.
And it's just
all different kinds of people, or all different kinds of clients, and all different kinds of sex workers. You can't point out a group of people that is any more diverse if the only tag you're going to give them is sex worker or client. You would never be able to pick up the good guys or the bad guys if that's the only information you have. You know what I mean? You've got to go deeper.
It's true.
You know, you've got to go deeper. You've got to spend a little bit more time investigating your arguments and understanding the concept of what it is you're proposing. And that's where anti-trafficking has failed again and again and again. Sex workers are experts in their own lives, but they are also experts at looking at the future. We have some incredibly intelligent people in this movement. I am not one of them. I am a service provider, and I'm fine with that. But we have people that are in our community that are absolute crazy good at policy and programming. And we have other people that are really good at technology. We have other good that are really good at storytelling. We have really good legal minds in this business. We have amazing people working on the front lines of human rights. So it's a huge group of people that we're all working towards the same goal. And you won't find an industry that is so rife with talent as the sex worker industry.
It's true. And
it's so many different skills.
And I know for a fact that there are people who could be working in under other industries if they just knew the right people, because they have so much talent. But because almost all of our industries these days are so gatekept, that people do what they can do with their talents. Yep,
that is correct.
There was a British, well, when she started out, she was a teenager, and when she retired, she was in her almost 60. And in her career, she went from playing naive 18-year-old ingenues to incestuous divorcees. Her name was Kay Parker. She had the best British accent ever. She was an actress who could have worked in Hollywood, in British cinema, could have done anything, played anything. Her acting was amazing. And of course, she was in porn movies back in the day when porn movies had stories. And so if a porn actor actually could act a little, it was a benefit.
Yeah.
She could have been a star.
In fact, they're being a story or they're not being a story.
She was in Best Little Whorehouse in Texas with Dolly Parton and did a great job.
Yeah.
But she never, up until that one little spot in a mainstream movie after she had become famous as a porn star, she never had any sort of mainstream break.
Dolly Parton.
Yeah.
I
And it's
come up.
Dolly Parton who gave her the break on top of everything else. If you think about that, that just makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. I'd come off the street for Dolly Parton.
Well, my favorite joke ever is Dolly Parton talking about maybe the worst movie she ever made, where she says that my agent really thought it would be a great idea if I did it with if I had sex with Sylvester Stallone, but the public really didn't agree.
I love her sense of humor.
I love that movie, actually, but when I found out what happened to it, it made totally so much sense. That's the movie that Sylvester Stallone decided to do instead of Beverly Hills Cop.
Oh, is it really? I didn't know that.
So Sylvester Stallone was offered the role of Axel Foley in Beverly Hills Cop and ended up not doing it because they wouldn't let him. Remember, he was coming off the success of Rocky, which he had written. They would not let him do rewrites for his character and have creative control over the project, which is what he wanted. They let him do that at Rhinestone, for better or worse.
Oh, you're talking about Best Little Whorehouse in Texas?
No, I'm sorry. I jumped off. So there's a movie called Rhinestone that stars Sylvester Stallone.
Okay, all right. Now I'm with you. Okay, now I'm with you. Okay, sorry. I was still going.
I jumped. My brain does this sometimes, and it's my fault.
I'm thinking.
It's my fault.
I can watch that movie again.
My brain makes silly connections between things.
Oh, I'm just relieved that I didn't miss Sylvester Stallone in Best Little Whorehouse.
No, you didn't. You didn't. Burt Reynolds is in there, I believe, but not Stallone.
Yes.
No, Stallone is in a movie with Rhinestone called Rhinestone with Dolly Parton, which apparently also he really wanted to make because he was really into country and really liked Dolly Parton, and that was part of it too. But
okay.
And so this was a personal movie for me, and I was disappointed when it went so badly on his side. And Dolly Parton's side is, well, I really thought it would be a good idea, but my fans didn't agree.
Oh, well.
But you just imagine, it could have been, what would it have been like if Sylvester Stallone hadn't taken over the writing and potentially ruined a movie about Dolly Parton making it as a country singer?
I don't know that you could ruin a movie with Dolly Parton in it.
That's true. It's true.
I don't know. I mean, I suppose you could, but I don't want to think about the whole thing. It would have to go wrong in order for that to happen.
And it's worth watching just to see Sylvester Stallone dressed like one of those 70s, 80s country singers in the rhinestone blue suede suit.
Yeah, he's in Tulsa King right now.
Yes.
Series on Paramount.
Yes, I haven't seen that.
He's just amazing in it. He really is. He's just amazing in it.
My favorite Stallone movies are all comedies, though, which is the funny thing.
Oh.
I mean, I like the funny parts in the Rocky movies more than anything else.
Yeah.
Like the best moment of Stallone's as an actor is still at the end of the wedding scene in Rocky 2, where Joe Spinell is trying to who plays the loan shark he used to work as a leg breaker for before he made it big as a boxer. And he says, have you ever thought of investing in condominiums? You could really make some extra money and take care of your future. And Stallone is like, condominiums? Yeah, condominiums. And he responds, I never use them.
Oh no!
Because he's Catholic, of course. I mean, he's a Catholic. But he's supposed to not be very bright and gets hit in the head for a living. So he hears condominiums, and his response is, "I never use them." But it's just such a funny moment, and it's that little thing because number one, it fits the character. It's good acting. It's how that character would respond.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just it's such a great situational comedy moment where he just spins the play off the word perfectly.
Yeah. He's a good actor.
And I love, even though it's a Shaggy Dog story, I love Oscar. And at the very end, who the hell are you? I'm Oscar. Get him out of here.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm being overrun with dogs for a second here. They
No,
just woke
no.
up.
I close my door and my cat can't get in here, but every now and then my cat hides in here while I'm doing the show, and everybody gets a chance to see him before I put him out again.
Oh, that's too funny.
I have a big white cat, and my wife has a big brown tabby. And now we're off the topic again, and I need to get us focused. Sorry, my mind wanders too much.
That's all right. That's all right. We're winding up. We're close to an hour.
Yeah, we are. We should be able to make a good transition in a couple of moments. But I will say that it was mutual aid and harm reduction that got me interested in sort of the politics around sex work in the first place.
And you know what keeps people here is the mistreatment that they get by the anti-trafficking world.
Yeah.
I've
seen that.
I think that's one of those things that people just can't imagine.
Well, I'm huge in the issue of workers' rights, and that's always been my number one. And from there, it was just sort of natural to really look into the conditions of criminalized workers.
Yeah.
Especially since I've got connections to the sort of thing in the family. My wife's from Chicago. When her maternal grandfather first got to Chicago, he was a truck driver and had a really hard time getting a job. So he had to get a job driving a delivery truck. The trouble is that the delivery truck was delivering whiskey to bars during Prohibition and was owned by Al Capone. So he was a truck driver, and his job itself was, in theory, legal, but the specific function of his job that he was performing was criminalized. One part of his job.
That's where we are in this world. Even though it's still illegal to sell it, it is criminal. They're trying to enact policies and programs and stuff within anti-trafficking that supports the partial criminalization option. And that's more palatable to the general public, but it actually is more harmful than full criminalization. And that's what people often fail to see. When you enact these policies that make part of an adult consensual transaction criminal and not the other half, is the fact that you still have the increased policing on that community.
Yes.
Marginalized and vulnerable.
And even more so because it's even more dangerous to be, in some ways, to be pressured to testify against someone than it is to be targeted for arrest yourself.
And it's just not good use of your time. I mean, I just have to be really honest with law enforcement. Running up prostitution stings and running human trafficking stings is not going to have the bang for your buck that you're hoping it will. It's just not. You're not going to eliminate the problem that way. You're creating a lot of drama and stress. And the system that is all of us advocates working within this can't handle it. There are no beds available for sex trafficking or labor trafficking survivors in the United States.
And as someone who grew up in California and lived in Tennessee and lives in Oregon now, all agricultural states, let me tell you, the number one reason that people are trafficked in the United States is agricultural labor, and the number two is meatpacking.
I would have to say that it's probably agricultural would be the first.
Yeah.
And the second would be the hospitality industry.
Well, that's true too.
I live in Orlando.
There are ways it's disguised in the hospitality industry so that it doesn't. So you can't tell that Donald Trump is trafficking his employees.
Right.
But Donald Trump is nevertheless a human trafficker and a slave owner.
Well, I mean, and let's make sure that we're using the right terms for something. As much as I hate Donald Trump and would love to label him as a trafficker,
he's a consumer rather than a trafficker. Yeah, he's the slave owner, not the trader.
He is a exploitative employer.
Yes, that's the right way to put it.
He is without question. There is more than way too many accounts.
Yes.
Of him failing to pay laborers that have worked for him.
All laborers. All laborers, not any one group.
Yeah, it wasn't anyone. It wasn't anyone. I'm sure there are housekeepers and lawn gardeners and just you name it that have all been screwed over by Trump. But the criminalization of the work activity is not helping. The criminalization of the purchase is not helping.
The fact that his employees are dependent on work visas that he signs off on,
yes,
means that he has that much more power.
Yes, and he uses that power to make them fear for their general safety.
Yes,
that is a very dangerous precedent to set, and that is illegal.
And if he can do that in the hospitality industry, imagine how much worse it is for criminalized workers.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. The gig workers are all at risk. Anybody who works for Uber, anybody who works for Lyft, anybody who works for DoorDash, we are all at risk because we are all working within industries that are gig economies, where we have a higher rate of surveillance. You can't tell me that someone who is out on the road driving for Uber 8 or 9 hours a day is not coming across more police officers on the road than those of us who are not working for Uber. So it's just, we've got to be
probably true.
We've got to be more focused on ensuring that our labor force is safe and secure, and the services that we have are the services. We need to reallocate all of that money that we're spending on all of these criminalization options and start making sure that people have enough food to eat, that their kids are getting to school, that if someone's calling in a domestic violence situation, that they have some place to go. You know what I mean? Those are the
now we're starting to get into that whole defund the police conversation that disappeared off the radar as soon as Joe Biden was successfully elected president, even before he was inaugurated.
Yeah. I mean, they're always going to avoid that conversation. You know what I mean? They're always going to avoid that. And the police are not the answer here. I don't want to, panic Cheerios, but more policing is not what we need. What we need is better policies and programming.
Police,
and we need decrim.
When you think that it was people in Los Angeles and New York who invented the American system of urban policing, who first went to Palestine in the 1960s and 1970s to teach the IDF how to do urban policing against their terrorism problem, and now the IDF charges a great deal of money to bring Americans to Israel to teach American cops urban policing so they can deal with their crime problem. You'll never convince me that the people who trained an occupying military and are now trained by that occupying military are going to be the solutions to any problems. They're just going to be an occupying military no matter what we call them.
Yeah. A different name doesn't make you a different person.
Exactly. Exactly. No, I agree. Do you have any final thoughts? I think we're in a good place to wrap up based on our conversation. Have we missed anything important?
I think that, we hit on the things that I really wanted to hit off. And that was just the really important thing of, if your job were a crime, you would have a really hard time meeting your needs and the needs of your family. So let's take a little bit more time to dig in and make sure that we're not talking about policies that we don't understand. Dig a little deeper, get a little bit big understanding, and let's decriminalize the world.
I would agree with that. And I would add one extra bit, which is to say that I'm old enough and well enough read to understand the consequences of California and some other states' anti-pimping laws. It's very important for everyone who doesn't know to understand that all a pimp is, in a legal definition, is someone who receives money from a sex worker. If the police choose to enforce the law as such, that can be somebody's husband, somebody's boyfriend, somebody's roommate, somebody's coworker who they loaned $20 to. It can be really really arbitrary if a cop wants it to be. And the real question that I really that I want to ask everybody is, do you really feel comfortable passing laws that leave all these decisions up to the people who kill people when they clearly have better options on the table, and then afterwards throw their hands up in the air and says, I was afraid for my life? Do we really need to give them more power? That's my final thought. And I would like to leave that question with everyone today.
Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Please, I would love to have you on again. Normally, I tend to go longer than this, but this was just a great length today. If you ever want to do something longer, feel free to let me know.
I would love to do another one when we start really digging into the Joey the Player case.
That would be good. If you could, we should definitely go ahead and do an episode on that. I will do some research and follow up when I can. Thank you.
You got it.
I admit I'm not as familiar with that one as I am with Crystal Kaiser or Ed Buck, Ed Buck I know because I'm from California.
Yeah.
And Crystal Kaiser I know because some of the people that I am very, very engaged with on Twitter were doing a very good job of publicizing that case. And I was trying to help some as I could. I don't know sometimes how much people actually pay attention to what I say off one or two specific topics, but I try to talk about a lot.
We never know. We never know where the good is done.
But thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone else for watching us. You can follow SWOP Behind Bars on Twitter at SWOP Behind Bars. See how simple that is?
That is correct. And you can see all of our videos on our YouTube channel too, which is at SWOP Behind Bars.
And of course, I am on Twitter at Eclectic Radical. Please follow me there. You can follow the show at The Eclectic Rad. That is the only place where the show is not The Eclectic Radical, the show account on Twitter, because my personal account was already Eclectic Radical. But The Eclectic Rad on Twitter, Eclectic Radical for me, Eclectic Radical on Patreon, as you can see here. And if you don't want to subscribe by the month, but you would like to pay enough money every now and then to keep me on the air at the end of a month,
please do so.
Cash App is Eclectic Radical. PayPal is Eclectic Radical. I try to keep the payment option simple. Folks, thank you very much. Thanks again, Alex. You have a great week. And everyone, we will tweet at you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.